Hello and welcome, everyone. This is our first webinar in a three-part series of Get Ready for School. The EECD partnered to contribute to this work, as well as NSECDIS, Autism Nova Scotia, and Hearing and Speech Centers for Nova Scotia. My name is Kim Reiner Briscoe. I'm the Provincial Autism Consultant for the EECD.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be joining you today. My name is Kelly Crocker, and I am the Provincial Inclusive Education Consultant here at the ECD.
Thanks, Kelly. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. It's important to remember the rich cultures and histories of Indigenous peoples and also some of the difficult parts of our shared history. We also want to value the contributions of African Nova Scotians have made to our culture, infrastructure, and industries throughout the history of Nova Scotia. We also just want to have a little note about language. Canadians on the autism spectrum have diverse opinions on language and how they wish to be referenced. Some people go by identity first, which is autistic, while others prefer to use person first language or person with autism. It's an ongoing discussion in the autistic community. And so, to be respectful of everyone's preferences, we will reference to autism that are interchangeably. Also, attending for this webinar would be some people whose children have already started school for September, or they may be looking ahead to starting September school for next year. And not all families will have received services yet from the Provincial Preschool Autism Services. Wherever you are in your journey, we're hoping to provide some general information on the start of school for your child, and just knowing that every child is unique and all your experiences may vary. So, the things we're going to go through today are just talking a little bit about school ready from early years to grade primary, information about registration and inclusive practices in Nova Scotia, the school transition meeting, school supports in public schools, and the programming planning process. So you might want to just jot down or just reflect for a moment on some of the successes you are currently experiencing with transition planning. And are there things that you're hoping to learn about transition planning or to think about, or any questions you have? I'll just give you a moment just to jot those things down and just reflect for a moment. So today we're going to talk about that everyone is ready for school. So, in our school transition process, we often hear that people talk about school readiness. We want to really acknowledge that children develop in different ways and at different rates, and there's really no agreed upon definition of school readiness. In fact, a landmark study that was done in 2007 found that the age of which children start school had little or no impact on predicting school readiness. So, children are ready for school. We meet them where they're at. Sometimes we have different expectations. So, the other thing that in these studies it was kind of helpful to look at is the parent and child expectations of readiness skills. Parents focus more on the academic skills, such as knowing letters and numbers, and teachers were looking at task performance, such as children communicating their wants, needs, and ideas, showing interest in learning, liking school, and following directions. So in this slide, I'm not going to read through it, but just thinking about all of the different areas for school ready. So the physical and growth piece, your social emotional development, how you approach learning, your curiosity, your interest in it, your language development and literacy level, that print concepts, and conceptual knowledge and application. How do you problem solve and play and your imagination? So all these pieces together. are really helpful for starting school. When we think about that change from early years to grade primary, there is a change for your little one becoming more academically oriented in primary versus the early years. And it is the new role of a student. So, what does a student mean? You know, that concept of what that looks like in school. Your teacher child ratios change, and there's a shift in services with support services available, but they're delivered differently than in the early years. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about services a little bit more later on. If you're looking at this and you've already registered for the fall, this wouldn't be as relevant. But if you're looking at information generally about registration for next year, children must be 5 years of on or before December 31st of the calendar year in which they're enrolled. And parents can choose to wait an additional year, so there is that option year for primary. Primary to grade 12 have options that can be taught in English and French, so you can look into those options if that's helpful for your family. Children may attend public school, private school, or provided with home education. So, again, you can look at the different options that are best for your family. And the government website has some good information on all of those three options that you can look at. You can register your child at your local school that they'll attend. There's a little address lookup part on most of the regional centers for education and CSAP websites. And you can just put in your local address and see what is your local school that your child will be attending. You can also go into the website for your Regional Center for Education or CSAP, or you can register online. So there'll be online links as well for that. If you need any support with registration, feel free to reach out to your school. Like I said, the regional center and some places have parent navigators that can support with that as well. Before the transition process can take place, your child must be registered in public school. So sometimes people will phone and want a transition meeting, and we don't have the registration information first. So you must have a registered in public school before we start the registration and the transition process. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly now to start talking about inclusive education.
Thank you, Kim. I'm going to do a little pivot here. Thanks so much. And all important information, we know that it can be daunting to send your little ones off into school. Some of them are quite large. As a parent, I've done that myself. And there's so much information. So hopefully we can help you a little bit understand the system today. One of the overarching policies that you'll hear people talk about or people will reference in the school system is our fairly new inclusive education policy since 2020. And you can find that on the Department of Education Early Childhood Development website if you just look that up. There's probably a link from most regional center websites and CSAP. But basically, it just states that inclusive education is a commitment to high quality, culturally and linguistically responsive, and equitable education that support the well being and achievement of every student in the building. And that all students should feel that they belong in an inclusive school. They should feel accepted, safe, and valued so that they can best learn and succeed. And when you go into the inclusive education policy, you'll see a bunch of guiding principles that overarch what the policy is about. We just kind of summed a few of them up for you today. That every student can learn regardless of where they're coming from, what level, what interventions have been in place. Every student, once they're in that building, can learn and be successful. And we operate from a strengths based approach where we're looking at every student's individual strengths and challenges. And of course, coming into primary, you are the keeper of all this information and you'll be providing those strengths and challenges to the school, the interest. And we'll talk a bit about that later when we talk about sharing information with the school. The policy talks about students best learning in a common learning environment. So that is that every student has a right to be in with their same age peers, learning, interacting, and being present with their peer group. We sometimes have some confusion around students who have to go into a separate setting to get some individual supports, and people saying that's not inclusive education, and that's not the case. It's that the student has that classroom where they have the peers, and then as we talk a little bit more about different tiers of instruction, it's that we can have that environment where students might need to go to learn best in a smaller group setting. But ultimately, it's the classroom environment where students will be most successful. One of the biggest changes in this policy is for student voice and choice. So often we might have had programming or decisions that were made, and we didn't include student voice. And this time, we're making sure that students are integral parts of their education, and that families are as well. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about some of the ways that we bring families and students into their planning. And of course, cultural and linguistic identities are honored and respected in our building and with our families. And another part that is really great is that this policy is talking about building collective efficacy. So what that means is that it's not just a one teacher, one person, one entity that is responsible for a student's success and well-being. It's that it's all of us working together. We're all building that capacity. We're all sharing and problem solving and building that collective efficacy so your child can be successful through the school system. So one of the big things in inclusive education is you'll hear this word sometimes, and people are often unsure of what it is, and it's MTSS. And basically, MTSS stands for a multi-tier system of support. Um, and essentially, it's a model that has various multi tiered systems. It's specific to the Nova Scotia context and is the framework that we use to support students' academic, social, emotional, and behavioral needs in an integrated way. And it eliminates some barriers between classroom and specialist teachers, which then fosters a school approach to teaching, learning, and student support. So, a great example of that shift would be in the past, we kind of went in with a student needing a specialist, and we went in saying the student had challenges and the student needed support. And then sometimes it would take a while for a specialist to come in and support that student. And through MTSS, and I guess I'll just put on the next slide so that we can see that, is that we can now go in under our tiered systems of support and support students at the tier one level, which is at the classroom level. So there was a misunderstanding that if students were in a classroom that they had to be removed to always get the support that they might need to be successful, which is not the case under this system of support. So, if you have a child and that child requires some support through speech language pathologist or school psychologist or school counseling, sometimes those specialists and itinerant specialists are coming into the classroom at the tier one level. And so they're working on social emotional learning, they're working on core curriculum concepts. They're supporting with resources and differentiating the instruction in the classroom along with the classroom teacher. So it's not a case of sitting and waiting for supports. It's that support is happening in a more integrated service delivery model, which is a great thing about the inclusive education policy. And then you'll hear sometimes under MTSS something called Tier 2 support. That is small group instruction. So there might be group students that are working on some behavior interventions, some literacy or math interventions, some language or specialized programming. And that can also be done in the classroom with the classroom teacher present, with a learning support teacher present, or a specialist teacher itinerant, and they're working with small groups in the classroom to support those students. And then often you'll hear of tier three supports, which is more individualized supports, where often an individualized referral may be required for your child. And in that case, you might receive a consent form that would come home, talking to you about an individual support that your child might need. And all that means is that once you sign that consent and you're talking to the school about what that individual support looks like, it means that that specialist or that teacher is then going to work with your child in a more individualized one on one setting. Kind of what I talked about earlier about leaving the classroom. So it's not denying that the child has an opportunity to learn best in a collaborative classroom with their peers, but they might need an environment that is more quiet, conducive to learning in a learning center or a resource room where they can work on those individualized supports. So that is, in essence, when you hear people talk about multi-tiered systems of support, it's a really positive thing because we're not waiting to get to that tier three. There are specialists and people that are supporting your child with all their peers in that classroom setting. So if you're in school and you're wondering how do some of those services come to be? How does my child get referred for a specialized uh, program or for an individualized intervention, um, then that often comes from discussions that are happening at school teams. So under inclusive education, it's important to know the differences when you hear people talk about school teams. We have in our schools what's called a teaching support team and a student planning team. So those are our two teams in the school. The teaching support team is more internal. It's led by the administrator, and it's working with their teachers and with their specialists and helping to strengthen the school's capacity to support student well-being and achievement. So they might be looking at doing that for a primary classroom where your child is, and it's supporting all the students in the room, which also benefits your child. It's on proactively engaging and building capacity among teaching staff, looking at resources and people that can come into the classroom, which supports every student. So again, not looking at it through a an individual student concern, but a teacher saying, I have a group of students in my class who may have autism or who may have challenges with language, communication, behavior, and that teacher is saying at that teaching support team, what services do you have available to me at that tier one or tier two level that can come into my classroom and support these groups of students and support me as a teacher, to which in turn helps them. So that is the teaching support team that every school has across the province under this inclusive education policy. The other team that you are an integral part of is the student planning team. So you'll hear people say SPT. Sometimes they'll say it and you're like, what does that even mean? And the acronyms are big in the education world. So if you're ever unsure of an acronym, I find myself every day saying, that's great. What does that mean exactly? Can you please tell me what you mean when you say SPT or anything else? It's an acronym world. The SPT is the student planning team. So that is the team that's put together that supports your child in the school system. So we work with parents, guardians to help them feel welcome in school, to empower them as essential decision makers regarding the programming and supports for your child. As I mentioned earlier, student voice and choice is very important under this policy. So this is the place where your voice is heard, your child's voice is heard, and it's very collaborative in how we're supporting students through the program planning process. So if you have questions and you need some answers, if you want to problem solve, then essentially this is where you are, having those discussions at the student planning team. I think it's important to note that as a parent, you have the right to request a student planning team. I also have a child who is neurodiverse, and sometimes people will say to me, like, well, how did you get a student planning team meeting to talk about how to support him? And I simply say, I asked, when can we meet? And the school will meet with me. and figure out how we're going to best support him in his well-being and achievement in his school career. One thing that is different I'm noticing lately since inclusive education policy is that the school is inviting him in to the discussions as he's getting older. It might not be as such something you'll see in younger grades because we don't want to talk about students in front of them, and we want to honor their dignity and respect. So sometimes it's the adults that are doing the planning, but as students are getting older, they definitely should be a part of that student planning team meeting to honor how they're feeling and what sort of things they might need in the school setting. So Kim mentioned earlier about a transition meeting that parents might call the school and ask for. Not every child has a transition meeting. It's definitely something that is individualized to what you might need as a parent or guardian in preparing for school. But if there is a need for a transition meeting, it would be the school who would set that up in the building, and they would be inviting in any external partners, any other supports and people who are working with your child. So it's up to you as the parent guardian to think about who you want to invite to the meeting, knowing the date and time. uh, it's important to note that since COVID, we've learned that student planning team meetings are not always about being physically present in the building. I've had many student planning team meetings about my own child where they were all virtual, which is great for families that have difficulties with childcare, with transportation, with jobs, and making time to be part of that student planning team meeting. So if physically going into a building is a barrier, then it is up to the school essentially to remove that barrier so that you can participate in that student planning team meeting um, virtually. And that is essential. So prepare your own questions. Who would you like to discuss at the meeting? Bring the list with you. Think about some key expectations you have for your child at school and ways that you can support these at home. Talk to the school about how best you want to communicate. Is it going to be calls, emails? Also, sometimes children have two homes or multiple homes, and often there's an issue with communication because some sort of documentation or some sort of communication might go to one home, which leaves the other parent wondering about things. So, talk to the school about if you would like multiple copies of things sent home, and how that should be done. It's really important to bring any copies of documentation that you have with you prior to a student coming to school. They don't have anything in their electronic system yet, their electronic student information file. So you are the keeper of this really important documentation that supports your child when they're in school. So by you providing that information to the school, they're going to upload it to your child's electronic information system. It's all confidential and secure, and then that information will be housed there in TineEd, is what the system is called. And once it's housed there, it's available to only the staff and teachers who need to see it, who teach your child. It's not there for everybody to see. It's very secure in view and create access. Consider preparing an About Me page, which is a snapshot of your student, your child, to share with the school. We talked about earlier under this policy. This policy deals a lot with the student's individual strengths, challenges, and interests, and really tapping into how they learn best, identifying their cultural and linguistic ways of learning and being. And for us to know that in the school system is really important. So anything that you feel we may need to know, you're going to pass on to your school. So, what to expect at a school transition meeting? Um, it is daunting because sometimes you go into a meeting and there are a lot of people there. Um, there there's people from the school. Overall, the school administrator is responsible for organizing and chairing the student planning team meeting. So they would always be present, either the principal or the vice principal, and the teachers would be present, and any itinerants that would be part of that meeting, and then of course people who would be coming externally that would be invited by the school as requested by the parent or guardian. So people are supporting, they're sharing information, they're talking about services and resources and planning for success. They're talking about different strategies, who's going to be responsible for doing different things. And then you can be provided with information, especially if this is coming into the school. Then you want to look at, what is the information you need to know around school orientation, school visits, because it is very different in regional centers and it's different in um, different parts of the province. So, even the other day, my sister was like, "Oh, we've been at the school twice already," and I hadn't. So, been to my child. So I was waiting for, emails and information to come in, and which we did receive, which was great. But my point of that story is that it's going to look different, and if you were in different parent groups and you're communicating and sharing information, that is going to look different in every school. So finding out what that looks like and how you can help with that transition is really important. Perhaps during the summer, you want to visit the playground, read about going to school, do social narratives and videos about big school and social stories. There will be people at that meeting that have lots of expertise and information that they can share about how to support that transition. Once your child is in school, there's different ways of communicating with home and school, and that's going to look different in every building as well, depending on the child and the teacher and the building. Sometimes you can have communication books that are filled out daily. Sometimes it's emails, and sometimes it's phone calls. But it's how you would communicate in that student planning team meeting about how you're best going to support and communicate with parents, guardians about their success. Another, definite communication you will receive about student progress are report cards. One great thing, again, since COVID, is that report cards no longer go home in the book bag in an envelope that's sealed, sometimes to be lost, and not be able to track them down. They now go to you electronically through the email that you provide the school when you register. So, make sure that that email is up to date and that you share that. If you do prefer a paper copy, that's also available to you. It's just nice, though, that when you are on your phone or you're sitting at an appointment and you need to pull that up, you can go into your email and that report card will be present. There's also parent and student teacher meetings that happen frequently throughout the year. Those are scheduled in. If you look at the school calendar for your school, all of those parent teacher meetings are already listed for the year. So you can put those on your calendar, find out when those are happening. Sometimes if you have, big student planning team meetings, perhaps that parent teacher small meeting is not required, but that again is up to your team and you as the parent guardian as you're moving forward and working with your teacher and your student planning team. And like I just mentioned, continue to meet as a student planning team as needed. There's no limit on how often you can get together in a reasonable need. So you meet as needed, and again, it can be a hybrid. You can come in sometimes, electronic sometimes, a phone call sometimes. But when you do have a meeting, you should know that the school is documenting those meeting minutes, which are great. It's a good thing to be documented because those will be distributed to you as to the parent guardian, and in there it will highlight some of those discussions, some of the action items, and things that were agreed upon in that meeting of what needed to happen after that meeting ended. Again, we talked about this already, but once you are at school, what sort of supports would your child have. In-class support at tier 1 and 2, which we talked about. You're going to hear in the inclusive education policy a term called learning support teachers. Those are teachers in the building that are often learning center teachers or resource teachers, or English and French as an additional language teachers, and math and literacy coaches, learning support teachers who help uh, children in the classroom in their well-being and achievement. There's also teacher assistants, and that is support as allocated. So teacher assistants in the building are not an automatic for every student. Every regional center has a process for allocation of teacher assistants. If you want to know how that happens, you can talk to your school administrator or your regional center to find that information out. And then referrals to specialists, which happen at the school team. School psychologist, speech language pathologist, and autism specialist. And Kim's going to do some more in depth discussion about autism services and supporting of specialists, I think now. Perfect. I'll turn it back over to Kim.
Thank you, Kelly. Every time I listen, I always, pick up another little tidbit about MTSS and inclusive education. So I'm going to talk about the referral process. I did want to just kind of highlight kind of the overarching piece of what Kelly was talking about you knowing your child and being that support for the school. So, regardless of where you are in this process, so you might be new to Nova Scotia, or you might have already been having some services through the preschool autism services, so have reports and that sort of thing. It's really, really helpful information for the schools. So they do rely, especially in that transition process, of finding out what we need to know for the referral process. So the way that it works is you see some of these titles. I'm going to try to, as Kelly said, lots of acronyms, try to make this a little easier. So with either if you're new to Nova Scotia and have a diagnosis, or if you've been through the IWK, you will have documentation about a diagnosis of autism. So that is one of the important pieces of information that's helpful to provide to the school to go into those confidential school records, which is the TINET process that Kelly was talking about. So, regardless if you have a diagnosis, a provisional diagnosis, or a suspected diagnosis of autism, or no diagnosis, there's still services. It's just the titles of those services may look a little bit different. So, through inclusive education funding, if you have a provisional or diagnosis of autism, the early intervention autism communication specialist. So that's, or EACS, you'll hear them often called. So that's the English version. And I do not speak fluent French, so I won't try to speak the French version there, but it's the same position. And it's SIPSA in French as the acronym. And then in later grades, once they're through their early intervention services, which is usually primary, sometimes into grade 1, there's autism specialists that are available as needed for the later grades. And that as needed piece is through that program planning process. So the early intervention autism communication specialist, or EACS, or in French, SIPSA, are speech language pathologists who have additional support and background for autism. And they consult and work closely with the school based speech language pathologist. So you may get a consent form home or have discussion about consent for speech language pathology, generally speaking, which may encompass both of those. Each regional center does that a little bit differently. Or you may get it specific for your early intervention autism communication specialist, or you may get specific for your school speech language pathologist. And on the next page, I explain a little bit more of how that works. But basically, it's to provide the speech language pathology support, and through inclusive education funding, have additional supports, in particular for that first year until the end of grade primary. The other thing is if your child is using a different way to communicate than verbalizing, or they're still kind of learning that language pieces through assistive technology, using an AAC such as Proloquo to Go or Speak for Yourself. The assistive technology piece, you may get a referral to either assistive technology specialist or an AAC, speech language pathology specialist. So, AAC through the regional centers will consult with SLP either through the school, as school based, or through an AAC speech language pathologist, depending on how that regional center has their services set up. So, it may be an assistive technology specialist who is providing that information on the basis of the language recommendations in conjunction with the speech language pathologist. So this is why it's, as Kelly was saying about, every school looks a little bit different. That's true too for each of the regional centers can look a little bit different. The services are there. They're the same services for supporting that language social means, but it might look a little bit different who's taking the main role with that. You can have consultation with the school psychologist or behavior specialist. We also have behavior support teachers who are often more at the school level. So, behavior support specialists may support the behavior support teachers to be able to be in the schools to provide that direct support. An occupational therapist or physiotherapist is also recommendations. And again, we wouldn't make all of these recommendations. It's as needed for your child. Sometimes music therapy is available. If there's medical needs, such as diabetes, any feeding tubes, any other type of medical needs like that, we can look at nursing supports as well. These referrals would be discussed with you in that transition progress or the school planning team. So, to kind of think about these pieces. And then Learning Center, Teacher Support, and Resource Center. Now, you might not get a consent home for those pieces. That'd be more of a discussion about needing those extra supports. It's also important to know with the multi tiered system of supports that you might not get a consent home, but there's still support being done in the sense of if you're doing tier one supports, for instance, and you're going in the classroom, your school speech language pathologist could be going in and working on some social goals with the whole class. And you might have some specific goals that are being worked on, and then those would have consent if there was specific goals. So this is just an example of how it could be broken down between those partnership with the school-based SLP and the early intervention autism communication specialist. So the early intervention autism communication specialist will really focus on that individualized planning needs. So things like the augmentative and alternative communication, such as a speech generating device, or if you're using PECs, that peer and play development piece to consult about those pieces, and receptive and expressive language. The school-based SLP may also be working in conjunction with those pieces. They may be working on some of the literacy pieces in the classroom. They might be working specifically in a tier 2 or 3 small group for articulation and speech. So the student can work with a specialist in the class and one-on-one or group situation. It's very dynamic, going in and out. So the specialist can be going in the classroom or can be maybe pulling out, depending on what the need is. But we always want to work on that transition piece into the classroom. And then they might be working as well with a consultant. So they're all working together as a team to really support your child. I just wanted to clarify too that assistive technology and AAC piece. Again, you'll see those two terminology. So, assistive technology, you'll often see it listed as assistive technology specialist or assistive technology support workers. A lot of times, in particular, the support workers would be working on that MTSS model through things like universal learning, Google Read and Write, or word predictions or magnifiers to help with things like literacy. And for AAC, you might see it listed as AAC, Assistive Technology AAC Specialist, just an AAC specialist. The EACs also have that specialty in AAC, and school based SLP, the SLPs have that specialty. So that's often for the individualized program for communication. And you may decide if you have a device that you're using at home for communication that you may want that to go back and forth from school. That would be a discussion to have. And you may have one device at home and one device at school that has very similar, has the same underlying program and very similar in how it's laid out. Um, and you want to think about that plan and have that discussion. So let the school be aware if there is AAC that's being used and a plan for that first day of school. And I know this might sound like, of course, but it's busy when you're trying to do everything. So make sure there's a charger, make sure it's charged, make sure it's in the backpack, that sort of thing, because we want them to have that best support on the first day and be able to communicate their wants and needs. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Kelly for the program planning process.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, so Kim was just talking about assistive technology and things that your child might need to be successful in school. So often there is some confusion around if that becomes an adaptation or not for your child. So the two terms that you're going to often hear when we talk about program planning process currently are the adaptations and the individualized program plans. So adaptations are those documented strategies that accommodate the learning needs of a student based on their learning profile. They are documented in that electronic system I referenced earlier, and a copy is provided to the parent guardians. They're planned, implemented, monitored, and evaluated, and they're just used to ensure that your child is achieving the public school curriculum outcomes. Again, if the adaptations are documented, they are also going to be available to you electronically. It's going to be different when they're sent home across the province in different schools, depending on when they send them home electronically. Some schools send them home the same time as report cards. Some send them out, September, October, or again in January. You just might want to ask at the school how you can get a copy or when you will be getting a copy of those adaptations. And the thing with tier one supports in a school system is, we have tier one means that everybody has the ability to benefit from a strategy or a resource that helps students learn. So a great example of that is in assistive technology. Kim referenced Google Read and Write. That's something that's now available to all students, and all students can use that, which will help them learn. But for some students who absolutely need that based on their learning profile or disability, they might need that documented in an adaptation. And so that would be the difference in, really strong tier one support and a documented adaptation. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and if you've ever been in a primary classroom, which I've observed in a lot, they're amazing teachers, and they know how to engage children, and the children love their teachers, and they know how and when to get students up for movement breaks and change up activities and do all those things. But for some students, it actually might need to be broken down even further, and they might need, based on their profile, to have more motion breaks or have different activities to do to impact their success. And that might be something that needs to be documented. But those are things that teachers will decide on, and also you can discuss at a student planning team meeting. And an individualized program plan, that is a individualized curriculum that is written for students. And it's not just a given that every student would have an individualized program plan. It's quite an extensive process to have one written for a child, which involves the parents and guardians. So anytime there is an IPP that is written in the area of academic literacy and numeracy, life skills, or social development, it is determined that it's required by the student planning team. It's based on individual strengths, challenges, and interests, and it's also through various assessments that would have occurred up until then and interventions. And again, it's decided by the team, which you are a huge part of. And then, of course, that IPP is monitored and assessed by the team throughout the school year. So, lots of information. I know that is new knowledge, new lingo, new terminology. But just want, Kim and I, and part of these webinars are just so that you are aware and have some of that. That knowledge in your back pocket so that when some of these things start to be talked about, that you already have the information, and can contribute to those discussions. And of course, if you have additional information or questions to share and things you want to ask, you can do that with your child's teacher, and of course at that student planning team meeting.
Thank you, Kelly. So we do have a video. I just want to show you the thumbnail. Unfortunately, with the recorded piece, there was just some difficulty with me being able to play it at the same time while it's recording. So I just want you to see this thumbnail there because there are a few different choices. And this is the link to it. So I'll just take a moment on that screen for you to write down the link to the YouTube video. So the video talks about the primary classroom. One of the things I really like about it is exactly what Kelly was saying about all the rich learning that's done and kind of showing those different ways that it's done. Learning through play is a big part of primary, and you'll see the different ways that you are learning through that in this video. And also, if you look around, in the background of the video and that sort of thing, you'll see all the rich ways that it's set up. There'll be visual pieces for schedules, lots of manipulative things that you can use so you can be hands on. There's like a rocking chair, for instance, like say you wanted a break, and maybe that's the rocking chair piece or the little bike. So there's lots of ways that teachers set up their classrooms so that they know the students who are coming in for that school year, and they really tailor and think about how that looks for their particular class that they have for that year. So it's just a nice little snippet to see what primary looks like nowadays with that. And I would like to thank Katie Carroll and Catherine Garside from the PPAS, the Preschool Autism Services, for inviting us to these webinar series. We've really enjoyed, contributing and talking about the school transition piece. And we'd love to hear from you for some feedback. You can try holding your phone up to the picture part for the screen for the QR code and see if that works to take you to that piece. There's just a few questions there, and if you wouldn't mind just taking a few moments to complete that questionnaire, that would be great. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.